All right. Anybody have anything you want to discuss? Yes, ma'am.
It did mention Jesus, Joseph at the wedding.
Yeah.
Did he, just wasn't there? He wasn't invited? He wasn't part of the family? Or is it just...
So that's a good, I'm glad you brought that up. I was just talking with my dad about the book of John. There's so much in this book, and I leave out a ton, It says on the third day this happened. Some people think that you add up all the days, it's 7 days, and John's talking about a new creation. The wine could be the new covenant and the old covenant. There's just a ton going on in the text that it's hard to mention it all. That's another one. Joseph's not mentioned, and a lot of people think that the reason for that is Joseph's actually dead at this point. A lot of people think that Joseph passed away. Reasons for that are that you don't see him I think the last time you see him is when Jesus is a little boy in the temple. So he's about 12, yeah. So you see Joseph there, and then you don't see him after that. And Jesus is called the son of the carpenter, and then a little bit later he's called the carpenter, not the son of the carpenter. And so some people think that's a sign that Joseph has died. Because if your father's alive and you work for your father, you're called the worker of your father. But once he's dead, then you're just the worker. And so that might be why Mary is kind of leaning on Jesus in this story, implying, hey, we need some wine, because Jesus may have kind of stepped up to take on the Father's role at this point in his life. That's all conjecture, but there's a couple things that indicate that might be the case. Uh-huh.
When they had the jars of water purification, so they just put their hands in there and washed them, or they washed utensils, that purification?
Mm-hmm.
Now, second question. Did they empty that dirty water before they put the new water in and made it into wine?
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying.
You thought they needed to?
Well, I don't think they needed to. I was just wondering, because I know everything would be perfect, but
Right.
I just figured,
I did think about that too.
Cooler if it was dishwater, that turned into fantastic.
Right.
That would be a better
Yep.
miracle than just pure water.
That's a great question. Okay, so the question is, did they change that old dirty, stinky water out before Jesus turned it into wine? And all you see in the text is there's the jars there. And so it doesn't say that they were partially filled, but it'd be almost unthinkable that they'd have these stone water jars there and there wouldn't be some water already in them. So we can pretty safely assume there's some water there. And then all Jesus says is fill them up. Right? He doesn't say empty them and fill them up. So, we're probably 98% sure that these are filled with dirty water, and then Jesus fills it up, which does, in my opinion, make the miracle even more substantial. And this is what Christ does. He transforms our sin into righteousness. Like the New Testament says, Corinthians, he who knew no sin became sin for our sake so that we might become the righteousness of God. So the righteous one becomes unrighteous, and the unrighteous become righteous. So we're that dirty water. We get transformed. It's amazing. Yep. Uh-huh.
So I'm not really sure about this, but it seems like I remember with their purification and the hygiene rituals and laws and all of that they would, I find it really hard to believe that they would just let a whole bunch of people come and put their hands in a pot and wash their hands. I believe that there would be somebody that would pull some out with a ladle, and they wanted to use running water.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure about that. I'm not positive of it, but I believe within the ceremonial washing that you're not polluting water
Yep.
and reusing it again.
Yeah, so that's this goes into the infant baptism debate.
Right.
Because when the New Testament says they would baptize, Baptists like to say, well, the word baptize means immerse. And so they would have this thing of water and they dip themselves in, and that's why we should completely immerse when we baptize. And they think that helps solve the debate, but in my opinion, that doesn't mean anything, because you can dip a baby in water. It doesn't show who should get baptized. But the reason I bring that up is that I think the most of the evidence indicates that they were doing all sorts of baptisms. They would completely immerse their whole bodies. They would dip their hands in. They would get a ladle and pour it out on someone. washing feet, yeah, there's just, they weren't so concerned of how's the water getting on my body. It's just get the water on me one way or another. Yeah.
Along that same line, when my wife and I were in Israel in 2014, they brought us to a little bitty thing that in the ground that people would step into.
Yeah.
And that's how they baptized.
Yeah.
It's kind
Yeah.
of weird too, but, you know.
Yeah, I think, did they call it a laver? I think they'd
I
call,
always thought a laver was
what's a laver?
a plate or something like that they.
Okay, yeah, maybe, or a baptismal pool. Yeah, you can, I think Rich has seen that, right? In the Holy Land, you can see a little thing cut out of the ground. That's where they go in to get baptized.
Steps going down to it, and walk through it, and steps going out the other side.
Yeah, yeah. They have one,
About the 3-day thing, I was thinking that the 3-day thing would also be Christ risen from the dead,
mm-hmm,
because at that point, then we are pure,
right,
right? So we are
yeah.
a good one after that, so.
Yeah, so that's another thing that I briefly mentioned that didn't make its way into the sermon. If you look in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And so there's just a ton written on this. People debate back and forth. Some people say, like Rich said, well, this is indicating the third day as in the third day of the resurrection. And so this is kind of tying Jesus' resurrection in with the wedding at Cana. So after 3 days, there's this newness that comes out. Other people say it was just the third day. There's no, John's not trying to make a theological point. He's just being chronological.
Can't believe that.
Other people say, well, if you look at chapter 1, it says the next day, 3 times or 4 times. I can't remember how many times. We don't need to look at all. But if you look at chapter 1, it says, starts in verse 35, it says, on the next day, and then verse 43, on the next day, and then I think one other time it says on the next day. 28? 29, yeah, on the next day. So there's 3 on the next days in chapter 1, and so some people say, this gets so, this is why I just leave all this stuff out, because it's like, who knows. But there's 3 on the next days, and there's that one verse that says this happened in the 10th hour. And so depending on how you interpret the 10th hour, that could mean 4 in the afternoon. It could mean like early in the morning, but it could mean 4 in the afternoon. And by that point, it's technically the next day. So you have 3 next days plus the 10th hour, that's 4 next days. And you add that with the 3, the third day in chapter 2, now you've got 7. And so some people say, well, this is John signaling the new creation. We've got 7 days. Jesus is kind of recreating all things with this water and wine. Or you could have both. You could have the 7 days plus the 3 days. I don't know. All of these kind of things are, they're in the text, but it's difficult to say unequivocally, this is what the text is indicating. So these are interesting things to talk about, but in my opinion, I think those are the kind of things you leave out of a sermon. You should hear from sermons like things that are provable in the text, right? This has textual support. This is here. When it's things like that, it's like, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. You don't want to hear that in sermons. So if you hear me saying, I don't know, making things up like that, you can be like, is that really in the text?
Why Cana?
What's that?
Why did he have to say where the wedding was at?
So the wedding in Cana, they're actually not even sure where that is. There's a few options for Cana. There's a Cana of Bethany, but this says this is the Cana of Galilee, and there's no evidence of that place existing, so this was probably some little town that wasn't really well known. And then after Jesus' time, that town was done away with, and we don't have any archaeological evidence. So the significance of Cana, I haven't heard anybody pin any significance to that, other than John is recording historical facts. So here's the place, here's the time, he's giving historical data. Sometimes that historical data also marries with a theological truth, but other times it's just a historical fact.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about a lot of speculation and so forth, but I think you would agree this distinct from the synoptic gospels, the Gospel of John's just full of symbolism.
Yep.
And underlying that, for me, when I read this the first time, my epiphany was that Jesus was inaugurating the new covenant. The water represents the law, just like you pointed out, the stone jars. So that's the law, and wine is symbolic of the new covenant.
Yep.
So to me, it's no coincidence that the first miracle would be like, hey, this is what's going on here.
Right. Yeah, so on that note, this is something that I was thinking about. This is more of an application type of thought than a theological one. But just considering myself and the way that I look at who God is, I was asking myself as I was studying this text, do I see God as this kind of God, this lavish God who pours out this abundant, glorious grace, this goodness on me? Or do I think of him more as like a miserly, kind of like, you better get it right or I'm going to push you out? So this text really challenged me on that, because there's a ton in the Bible about God's wrath. I mean, I was looking up all the verses on wine, and it's like 9 out of 10 are bad. It's like God's giving you the cup of the wine of his wrath, and you're going to drink it, and he's going to pour his wrath out. You look at Revelation, it's the harlot drinking the wine of God's wrath. Like, yes, God is angry with sin, but the thing that this text corrected me on, was that angry God is angry. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. The psalmist says God is angry every single day. He is angry at sin. But that God, to me, let me say, for me, I don't experience that God because I'm under grace. Right? And this is something I know we know, but at least for me, and maybe for you, I forget this so easily. You know, God can't be angry at me for my sin. He can be angry at my sin. He can discipline me for my sin, but he can't have wrath against me for my sin because I'm a Christian, because that sin was paid for on the cross. If God's angry at me, if I go out and sin and God's angry at me, then he's unjust, because Christ paid the penalty for that sin, and now I'm paying the penalty for that sin. Christ paid the full penalty. And so for Christians, this is the God that we serve, this lavish God who says all the sin's gone and it's just new wine. Now there might be discipline, of course, there's chastisement, but it's all done in love. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Sometimes I wonder, what does God's anger look like? When we think of anger, it's like, a father being, abusive to his child or,
Right.
or whatever. His anger's gotta be different than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so go ahead.
I think about Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Is it separation though from, what do you mean?
I mean, he didn't hold back, he burned them to a crisp.
Yeah. Fire and brimstone, yeah.
Fire and brimstone, I know God's
Well,
anger.
what about the earth?
God's anger is not the same as my anger, because my anger is always out of control.
Mm-hmm.
God's anger is never out of control.
Yeah.
He's just in his judgments, so the punishment is perfect.
Right.
Flooding the whole earth, everyone died too.
So the cleansing the temple, to me, is a good example. I think the Greek word is like a violent, what's the word? It's like he was not, appearing to people to be in control of his emotions. Cracking a whip, he's kicking over tables,
Yeah, so this is an interesting conversation. We've had this conversation before, but I think it's worth revisiting. There's some variance on this. My read of the Bible is that the most significant manifestation of God's wrath is a handing over to sin. So the fire and the brimstone, I don't think that's the height of God's wrath. I think what's interesting about that is, not always, but usually when God demonstrates his wrath, especially in the Old Testament, it's a natural disaster. Right? I guess fire and brimstone isn't very natural, but there's a flood, there's a famine, there's pestilence, right? It's all these natural disasters that God uses to manifest his wrath. And so when I look at that, what I see is, well, what's God doing? He's saying, I'm removing my protection from you, and now this crazy world you live in is going to have its way with you. It's not necessarily, I don't necessarily see it so much as God cracking a whip, so much as saying, okay, I'm removing my protection and I'm going to allow your sin to consume you. And I get that from Romans chapter 1, which we've read before. But if you look at Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 22, it says, professing to be wise, they became fools, exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the likeness of corruptible man and of birds, four-footed animals, crawling creatures. Therefore, after all this sin, and I didn't read all of it, it goes back earlier. After all this sin, therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. Why? So that their bodies would be dishonored among them. And then verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to dishonorable passions, for their females exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. Same thing with males. Verse 28, just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to an unfit mind to do those things which are not proper. So 3 times in that text, when Paul is setting up the gospel, he's saying, here's sin. 3 times he says, well, here's God's response to that sin. God's handing over these sinners to their sin. And so when I read of the natural disaster judgment, I see some of that there too. Now, I'm not saying God isn't also dispensing his wrath in more of an active sense. But I think that the height of the manifestation of his wrath is to withdraw his goodness, because St. Augustine said, sin is its own punishment. You know, if you sin and you just keep sinning, the worst possible thing that could happen to you is just for you to be left alone in your sin. The sin eventually eats and decays and ruins your life. And that's what hell is. Hell is just this endless buffet of sin, but there's no goodness for the sin to feed off of. And so it's this craving, this lust for sin that's never satisfied, continually destroying you, but you can't die. And I can't think of anything worse. You know, I'd rather be turned on a spigot over fire and roasted, you know. Annihilated, especially, yeah. But just being set free into my sin forever and ever with no goodness to kind of like mitigate it, you know. So, for example, I do think, you know, you look at homosexuality, not to beat on a dead horse, but this is just, maybe I shouldn't pick this one, but it's the one that comes to mind. You look at homosexuality, there's negative repercussions that come from this, right? There's the AIDS thing, the lack of procreation, you can't have children. There's all these problems that come from it. But we live in a society where, well, I can adopt, I can have treatment for AIDS. We have all this goodness that mitigates the negative effects of the sin. But hell, there's no medical care, there's no adoption, there's nothing to mitigate the negative effect. It's just the negative effect stringing on forever. So that's the way I think of God's wrath. And when we come to this text in John 2, like that's being cast out into the outer darkness, but then inside God's house is just this constant, the opposite of it, feeding of righteousness, constantly giving us this new heavenly wine. So that's the way I contrast. It's not mean and angry God and nice God, but it's just God who says, go and do what you want. And for those who are in my family, I'm going to bless them. That's the way that I conceive of it.
So, how is God allowing Satan in all of this? So then, when they turn over, then it's just, they're listening to Satan instead of God. So God's allowing Satan to sort of take over some things?
Yeah, so Satan is he's kind of like, he's the Antichrist in the sense that Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. So what happened to Jesus is he's the first installment, and we're all following after. I think Satan's the anti of that. He's the first one who has been handed over to his sin, and so he lives a life consumed by sin. And so God is allowing Satan to operate in order to lead away those who are opposed to Christ. You're either going towards Christ or going towards Satan. Unsaved people, yeah.
He has the title, the Prince of the Power of the Air. So, I mean, if that doesn't, illustrate the fact that God has allowed him to have that much influence. Real interesting point on you said something about fire and brimstone. You don't know what that is. I just saw a little reel of some archaeologists, and they were in, I think, Sodom. And there are these strange little things that you don't find anywhere else. It's just like little melted balls of, volcanic whatever.
Yeah.
And so.
No, I think that's literal. Yeah, yeah. I think I've seen videos too where they can light. They have little sulfur balls, and you light it on fire, and it
Yeah.
burns different colors. And yeah,
So, not to change the subject, but one of the things that you said that I've never thought about was the fact that Jesus was likely drinking wine, because, you know, I mean, he was an observant Jew, but like, why wouldn't he be drinking wine? And I just think that that's kind of interesting, because I juxtapose that he's kind of partying, and then he does this incredible miracle, his first
yep,
miracle.
Yep.
I just think that's really interesting.
yep, yeah. So that's
Miracles when you're drinking wine, folks. I guess that's the
yeah,
Well, you can get
the
drunk.
lesson.
right.
But I understand the wine they drank was quite different than the wine we drink.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say,
Yeah.
and they had no good water source, Israel has horrible water,
Mm-hmm.
so.
Yeah, so their wine was a lot more diluted. Some people think like 4%-ish, so it's like a Coors Light, it's a really light thing. But it's not like you can't get drunk off of it. The word here in the text is methusko, which means to get drunk. So, yeah, that opens up a whole interesting conversation, because a lot of people try to avoid, John MacArthur being one of them, who is as a brilliant expositor on 99% of the stuff he talks about, and then two or three things, it's like, where is this coming from? But that's one thing he'll say is, the wine that they used was grape juice and things like that, and so we
That's
shouldn't
why
be
you're not
drinking
supposed
wine.
to get drunk on it, because it's grape juice.
Right,
I mean, think about it.
yeah.
It's
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't make any sense. But the point is, the Bible clearly prescribes wine for its feasting. In the Old Testament, at the Passover, they had wine, and the tradition now that's been passed down is that they have 4 cups of wine. So if you've seen, we had the Jews for Jesus people come and do a Seder, and they showed us all that, and they have 4 cups of wine. And so what Jesus is manifesting here is the perfect biblical balance. The Bible talks about wine as something really positive and something really negative. It's a gift from God, and it's also a manifestation of God's wrath. The harlot on the beast in Revelation has the wine of the cup of God's wrath, and then the psalmist says, you give wine to gladden the heart of man. So it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. And what makes the difference? Well, abuse, and you do too much of it. So what Jesus is exemplifying here, when he's called a drunkard because he's drinking wine, not that he was drunk, but the fact that people call him drunkards means he was probably drinking wine, is he's exemplifying the ability to use God's good things and rejoice without overdoing it. And that's what heaven's going to be. Heaven is going to be the use and reception of all of God's goodness without ever overdoing it. And the reason for that is that we'll live in a sinless world in heaven where it's impossible to overdo it. Right? The most glorious thing about heaven is the presence of God, and that's the one good thing in the whole world that you can't do too much of. You can't have too much of God. You can't read your Bible too much, pray too much, worship too much. You can't have enough of God. And so in heaven, the thing that's going to be most glorious for us, that we're going to appreciate the most, is going to be fully open to us, and we'll never be able to abuse it. And so Jesus is kind of foreshadowing that here in this text a little bit. So.
I also appreciated the thing about the woman, mother. I never thought about that. The Catholics are always looking for a way to venerate Mary and have her be co-redemptive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this text is really, some Catholics will use this as evidence for their Mariology, their veneration of Mary. They say they don't worship Mary, they venerate her. And so they'll use this text as one of them, but I think this text is solid evidence in the other direction. Jesus is not disrespecting Mary, but he is setting up a huge distinction between himself and her. And it's extremely, like I mentioned in the sermon, it's a really important thing, because some Roman Catholics, Catholics like to make it sound like they're all the same, but they're just as divergent as Protestants. There's a million different types of Catholics. Some are actually pretty good on these things. They just say Mary was just really blessed. I mean, logically speaking, if you give birth to Jesus, you're the most blessed woman who's ever lived. And I'm fully on board with that. I fully agree. But then other Catholics are on the other end of the spectrum, and they say, well, she's a co-redemptrix, and she assists in our salvation. Her and Jesus work together. Now they'll say Jesus does most of it, but Mary's still involved in the process. I mean, after all, she gave birth to Jesus. Without her, we wouldn't have Jesus. And so we pray to Mary, and she takes our prayers to Jesus. So she kind of, what do you call that in basketball? Assist, yeah. Like when you pass it, alley-oop, then alley-oop. Jesus is dunking it, but Mary's throwing it to him in the air, It's an alley-oop. They're working together. Jesus gets the glory, but without Mary, it wouldn't be as cool. So that's the way a lot of Catholics teach, and that's extremely, extremely dangerous because the Bible over and over again says, apart from Jesus Christ, there's no way to be saved. Right? What's the verse that Jesus says? None come to the Father except through me. I'm forgetting the whole verse. That famous verse. Yeah. But Jesus says, none come to the Father except through me, right? And so if we're saying you get to the Father through Jesus and Mary, well, is that meeting the criteria of coming to the Father only through Jesus? Well, it's not meeting the criteria. It's to introduce some idolatry, and it's extremely steals glory from God. I and the Father are one. No one comes to the Father except through me.
But it's also her nature with the Immaculate Conception. So they're deeply invested in that. And then I believe that they say
They also
that,
believe she has no sin.
Yeah, that's the Immaculate Conception.
so that's another heresy. But, and then
So that's an interesting thing to think about. We're kind of
children,
it's interesting to think about. This is how heresy works, right? It starts on some little biblical principle. Mary gave birth to Jesus. It starts with this seed, and then it just starts to grow. And then it becomes, she's helping Jesus. And then it becomes, well, she must be sinless like Jesus was. So now you get the Immaculate Conception, which is nowhere even close to being in the Bible. But as you start, you have this wrong view. And then what happens is you have to invent other things to support that view as it starts going along. And so that's a lot of the problem in the Roman Catholic Church. And the reason it comes about is because for the Roman Catholic Church, inventing stuff to support these errant views is part of their system. Anybody know why that is? They're okay with that. They say, yes, we're inventing stuff that's not in the Bible. And
church authority.
Church authority. Exactly. So for the Roman Catholic Church, there's two sources of authority, the Bible and church tradition. So if something's not written in the Bible, but the church has taught it, they're perfectly fine with that. And so that's what makes us so different from Reformed. What's the sola that goes against that? Anybody know? Sola Scriptura. So the significance of Sola Scriptura is we have one standard, the Bible. Tradition is helpful, it's useful, but it's not our source of authority. We only have one. It's not a man, it's not a tradition, it's not a pastor, it's only the Bible. The Bible is our sole authority. And so the reason for that is when you have an errant view and you're trying to prop it up with all this other stuff, the Bible is this sword that comes in and just cuts it off at the root. We can't venerate Mary because we know she wasn't immaculately conceived because Immaculate Conception is not in the Bible, and the Bible says precisely the opposite. We've all been born in sin. David says in Psalm 51:5, "I've been born in sin, and in sin did my mother conceive me." So the Bible says the opposite. Nobody's born sinless. So yeah, that's just the importance of the Bible. If we start to veer, it not only can mess with theology, but it can literally put someone's soul on the line, because now I'm believing in Jesus and Mary for the salvation of my sins, and I'm standing before God, and God says only those who believe in Jesus are granted entrance to heaven. And now we've got all these people saying, I believe in Jesus and Mary. So that, yeah.
A good example, in my opinion, of what exactly what you're saying is papal succession. The idea that Peter, they believe Jesus said, "You are Peter, and upon this stone I will build my church."
Yeah.
Out of that came the authority, the church authority, to have all these other things, the
Right.
sacraments and
Yep.
papal succession.
So let me pose this question. In light of all that, do you think we should be Baptists who have no hierarchy in the church. If you go to a Baptist church, there is no, it's technically the church member is the highest level of authority. The elders are just basically members who go to more meetings. And elders essentially has the same level of authority as a church member, and that's you see that because they have member meetings. We have one once a year. They usually have them once a month, if not quarterly, because the members that's where the vote is. Pastors, elders are all on that same level of authority. And then that individual church is on its own. If they start doing something wrong, and every single Baptist church in America says, hey, you need to stop teaching that church can keep doing what it's doing because they're not connected together. Each church is its own little outpost. So in light of that, papal succession and things like that, do you think that that's a better model for the church?
No.
Why or why not?
No, because it's not biblical. I mean, in my understanding, that if you look at what Paul's saying, there is a hierarchy, there's structure.
Mhm.
We're supposed to submit to those authorities over us,
Mhm.
the eldership and so forth.
Yeah.
But I don't, it
That's
just
why
doesn't
he
even.
has rules for what elders and deacons should do, so that they can be in positions of authority.
So let me ask this. Obviously, we're in a Reformed church, so yeah, that's not a surprise, right? The Bible, I can show you some verses if you like. The Bible teaches that there is a structure for God's church. But let me ask this. If that's the case, why don't we just have a Roman Catholic structure? Right? They've got a lot of authority. Why don't we do that? They abuse that authority. Well, people in the CRC abuse their authority.
But do they have a disciplinary action for those?
Yep, there's a disciplinary action.
Scripture is the highest authority,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
at least in theory. They don't. I mean, they
Yeah.
can reinterpret and have, on occasion, with successive popes,
Mm-hmm.
and they, yeah, at
Yeah.
that time.
Right. So there's two main things. That's one of them. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't have the authority of the Bible as the head. It's the Pope and the Bible. That's one. What's the other reason? What's the difference between the Roman Catholic Church structure and the Reformed Church structure?
Well, we have, it's democratized, that's what I see.
Right. Right.
Yeah, rather than have one guy that's,
Right. I mean, it's obvious we don't have a pope, right? And so that's really important for the Bible's presentation of church structure. The Bible doesn't teach Baptist ecclesiology that there is no structure, but it also doesn't teach that there's a vicar of Christ named the Pope who leads the whole church. What the Bible teaches is that God gives elders and deacons, and those elders and deacons lead churches that are all connected together. And when there's a problem, the leaders of those churches, like in Acts 15, the leaders get together and they say, like they did in Acts 15, hey, should we keep circumcising or not? And all the elders debate and discuss, and they say, nope, don't need to circumcise. The elders go back to their churches and say, here's the rule, no circumcision. So there's a connection, there's a leadership element where everybody's not just a layman. However, there is no single person in charge of the whole church. There is no pope. And that's extremely important because for the Reformed, we understand Christ to be that person. Christ is our pope. Christ is the one who rules the church. And that's, again, what's so dangerous about Roman Catholic ecclesiology is, in our view, the pope